you mark it with the next exhibit number? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here today. I know you have a very, very busy practice. Thank you very much. Ms. Sandra, you have been provided with your affidavit, and you can confirm that you're familiar with the contents.
Please take a full name for the record. Please take a full name for the record.
Diane Rose.
Do you swear that the evidence you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and the whole report?
I do.
Please raise the right hand and so help you God.
So help me.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Ms. Sandra, so the purpose of you being here today is to provide information that you obtained as a researcher, and also to highlight certain aspects of a book that you co-authored. Could you tell the court about the book, just the title, who the co-authors are, when it was published, please?
Yes. I mean, I can even show you. This book was published in 1987 based on a report that was released in 1985 based on research that was done 1983 to 1985, the beginning. Written by Don Foster. It had chapters by Dennis Davis, and I was the researcher of the whole project.
Your CV is attached, but could you inform the court of your qualifications, when you obtained them, and where?
I got a social science degree at UCT in 1981. I got a applied psychology degree in 1986 from WITS. I got a master's from Rhodes in clinical psychology in 1988. And I qualified as a psychoanalyst in 2016.
And Ms. Sandler, it was during your time at university when you became more politically aware, and what were the circumstances that made you become more politically active in that space?
So I went to UCT in 1978, became active in the National Union of South African Students in about 1979. It was a very particular time of student politics, post-Black consciousness. The white student movement was very aware of its position in relation to the split from USAS that had happened in the mid-70s. The work that I did was related to the re-emergence of trade union activism, then the school's boycotts in 1980, and UCT students, we were supportive, it's in a supportive role. It was in 1980 that friends of mine were detained, the white students, active students. I was with one when the security police arrived at his home. And I was active in USAS. I was active in slowly the emergence of detainees parent support committees as well. So quite a few things, and then worked for USAS full-time in 1982 as a national, it was called Secretary General at that time.
Thank you. And when did you start working on the book?
So in my third year psychology, I had a personal interest in the impact of detention on political detainees, and specifically I looked at sensory deprivation. And that was my third year psychology. Before I worked for USAS, before the detainees parent support committees, in fact, that was 1981. But there was the re-emergence, I think, nationally at the question. And it was out of that, my supervisor was Don Foster. He was a lecturer at UCT Psychology Department. The year 1982, 83, the interviews started till November 85. The report was released in mid-85, very important. A lot of, I think people remember that in fact lots of mass detentions started happening 85, whereas this covers 74 to 84. Mass detentions 85, big pressure to release the findings. So there actually is an initial report that was released in 1985, and then the actual book was published in 1987.
And how was the research undertaken? Can you break it down?
The methodology.
Yes.
So we spent a lot of time developing an interview questionnaire with the input from various academics, but very much having discovered the work from an institute in Copenhagen where we went in 1983, which linked us to international research at that time into the impact of torture. It was a rehabilitation center, and we connected with a lot of people in 1983. But here in South Africa, I employed 9 researchers, Joburg, Durban, East London, PE, Cape Town, and they all used the questionnaire, were trained in it, they recorded it. The recordings were transcribed in Cape Town, we got all that material. And just remember, I do want to say, 83 to 85, this is the height of repression. So, questions have always been asked, why did people want to participate in such a project? They were activists, people were working all over the country, but they did. The intention was to participate in a empirical study, in a systematic study. It had never been done internationally, it had never been done in South Africa, even though there had been lots of evidence, reports, Amnesty International, United Nations, everybody knew torture was going on. But there hadn't been a systematic study, which probably will outline a little more. So people were activists in the various centers and through activist networks. Once that had been okayed by political activists and leadership in various cities, it was very easy. People participated in this project.
And how many political detainees were interviewed?
So we actually interviewed maybe 200. We used 158 of them because some weren't sort of sufficient, sometimes through error and transcribing. Some had to be discarded. Many of the detainees had been detained numerous times, and each detention was taken as a discrete experience. But we used 158 in the end.
And what were the general conclusions drawn after we had obtained all these interviews and all the data?
It's sort of a very general overview of detention and torture in South Africa.
Yes.
Just to say that it was, a particular focus on the experiences, literally from whether people were harassed pre-detention, detail of when they were taken in, how many policemen, cars, where they went, conditions of detention, psychological torture, physical torture, whether they saw magistrates, whether they saw medical people, whether they saw family, whether they saw lawyers. There's a lot of detail of the experience. And really in the end, it was it categorically showed that torture in South Africa was ubiquitous and extensive and systematic. It was part of political detention. There was no question about that.
Thank you. And in your paragraph 16 of your affidavit, you've encapsulated this in your book. And could you read that out to the court?
16.
Yes.
Okay. In respect of the general conditions of detention, I can do no better than turn to the book itself. Conditions for those held under security law detention in South Africa are harsh. Even prior to the event of detention itself, the majority of respondents reported that they were subjected to harassment in one form or another. The process and experience of detention itself, quite apart from the issue of torture and psychological forms of abuse, were found to be harsh. from the moment of arrest to confinement and interrogation. The harshness of detention refers to physical conditions, the fact of isolation from support groups, the threatening attitude of authorities, and not least, the mental state of the detainees, particularly as regards the unpredictability and uncertainty of the situation. Fears and anxieties about possible subsequent events, including facing serious political charges, prolonged detention, physical abuse, or being coerced to turn state witness, all compound the mental fragility of the detainee.
Thank you. And then in your book, you also have appendices, and you've then grouped the factual findings in the appendices A to I, but for our purposes now, the appendix H deals with physical torture, and then I deals with psychological torture. Could you go to those appendices, please, DS2, and explain to the court how that was, your findings in that regard?
Yes, it's on the one hand a curious research project because it had wanted to gather information, but also allow the detainee, ex-detainee, to also speak freely. So they were guided on the one hand about your experience, were you tortured, and the whole list literally extracted from all of these interviews what happened to people. So the forms of physical torture, the one is by age group, from under 20 to people over 40. And it starts, from no physical torture. And I don't know if you want me to read. Okay. Sort of in order, the top is beatings, which is internationally, that is ubiquitous. It's always at the top of the list. Forced standing, and this is in South Africa, maintaining abnormal body positions. I mean, I'm sure many people know helicopter, various forms of torture that people experienced, forced gym exercises, bags over head, electric shocks, food deprivation, strangulation, suspension, cold water immersion, deprived water deprivation, application of cigarettes or chemicals, bright light, excess cold, excess heat, walking barefoot over glass or stones, and other torture. And there's a list in the books of other things. But those were the main things in South Africa we found.
And the psychological torture?
So at the top of the list, no psychological torture because no one ticked that box because, of course, it all is. And it is also recognized, the United Nations, when they changed the definition in 1980, included the psychological stroke mental dimension. False accusation, solitary confinement, verbal abuse, threatened with violence, good, bad interrogator, given misleading information, being told lies about things, witness or knowledge of other people's torture, threatened with the execution of self or family, being offered rewards, forced to undress, constraint, constant interrogation, blindfolded, sleep deprivation, threatened with prolonged detention, knowledge of abuse of friends or family, sham executions, administration of drugs, excrement abuse, use of animals. Other psychological torture, which for some of the women there was a lot of sexual threats.
Sandra, can you also then, you've broken it up in percentages as well. So you've got for the over 40s, which would be the category for Imam Mabrur. Could you then just be a bit more specific in the context of physical?
So, I mean, in terms of the table and the number of people over 40, there were 10 in the study, which you can think is a little, but I guarantee statistically this is all very, very, within the correct sort of framework. So the over 40, half of the people we interviewed told they were beaten. So if you want to extract that to this situation, I think 50% is pretty high.
So your conclusions regarding torture, you've set that out in paragraph 18 of your affidavit. Based on the consistency of the data, torture was widely and relatively systematically practiced in South Africa. You want to add anything?
I think that understanding that torture was widely practiced in South Africa was something that everybody knows from the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. But I think that the unique contribution of this study is that it is a systematic study with, and it's still the largest that I'm aware of in the world, and really detailing from the detainees' experiences. And they had nothing to gain from it at the time, other than bringing something out into the open at a particularly political time in South Africa's history. So providing, and at the time, 83% of political detainees were tortured. That's what's in all the newspapers, 83%. That's very high. And that is, in a way, at a certain level, the contribution to really, categorically state that torture of political detainees happened systematically, not aberrant behavior. It was part of the way the security police worked.
And your period, as you said numerous times, was over. It was 1974 to 1984.
Yeah.
That was the time frame.
Yes.
74 to 84.
Yeah.
And we know that Imam Haroon was detained in 1969. But you then detailed in your affidavit that certain things were still happening at the time in that period, and you've referenced something from one of the detainees and his experience in Maitland. Yes, at Maitland Police Station. Could you read that out to the court?
Yes. Let me just. That's 20. He says, when I was in Maitland Police Station, it was a horrifically filthy cell that I was in. The blankets were covered with excrement, no drinking water. There was a flush toilet with a wire that you pulled on the wall. I was very thirsty and I wanted to get water, and they gave chips and fish as an alternative, and I had to get water from very unhygienic circumstances. I had little scratches and it all turned very septic and my fingers swelled up, and in fact family and lawyers got to see me afterwards. And they thought that I had been tortured. So that was quite grim, but that was just the first night. The second night I was switched to another cell, to the white cell in Maitland where Haroon had been killed. In both cases, my lights were outside and I was sleeping on one of those mats.
Thank you. And of course, when you're doing the interviews for these, with these detainees, they are telling you who tortured them, but they know that's never going to form part of a book published in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And you then subsequently, thank you, found some notes. And can you tell us what you discovered looking at your notes?
Yes, in 1995, when the TRC was beginning, I thought the torturers that were named in all these interviews, something could be done. So I went through every single interview and took down the names that were mentioned in the transcripts, and just wrote them down next to, just wrote down their names next to each interview. So I know it's attached, it's in my handwriting from 1995, all the torturers' names. So that's where it comes from.
And then can you tell us about certain Specker and Ben?
Yes, so specifically the Cape Town interviews, of which there were about 31, 11 people mentioned Sprake van Wyk tortured land. That's like more than a third.
Sandra, could you tell us a bit more what, through this research, what you ascertained about security branch members, the type of person, you know, there had to be a special type of person to be involved in this type of torture. And you've said that there was secrecy involved. It was always secret, where there was a veil of secrecy around the security branch. Could you give any further information?
Yes, I think that it was referring, you know, the focus of this research was not on the perpetrators,
No.
as we know, but I think the emphasis on the sense of secrecy and being written in that way in the 1980s references that they were law unto themselves, that the veil of secrecy that was created, of power, of you know, above authority, and that whatever was being done was behind closed doors and no one would know.
And you also mentioned that they were trained, they were well trained.
You know, it was our view. I think before it was our view, and one always kind of knew that torturers internationally, and it's not only in South Africa but in other countries, exchanged information. The understanding here at the time pre the research was particularly France with the Algerian War, so we're talking in the 70s. But I think where this research, the evidence, where you see international studies which, you know, are the same, similar, very similar. There's some differences, Latin America, kind of here, but I have no doubt in my mind that torturers, you know, get together to exchange information. I don't have evidence, by the way, that they were trained. That didn't come up. But I think the sense of the extent and the similarity around the country does point to a kind of cohesion at some level. Yeah.
Well trained.
Well trained.
Okay.
Well trained. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the time. My Lord, and those
Thank you.
Thank you, my Lord. Nothing for mistakes. We had the benefit of reading the book, and it is also part of our values, my Lord. Such I have no questions for let's go, please, my Lord.
Thank you. Let's start off with the focus. It's Don Foster, not John Foster. Not the man in whose name the now Central Police Station in Johannesburg is named. It's not that man.
No, it's an F.
It's D-O-N and F-O.
F, yeah.
I see. And the other co-author, Dennis Davis, is the man who once graced this bench as a judge. I see. Now, the people that you interviewed, were they exclusively political detainees or just detainees in general?
Exclusively political detainees.
At the time of the interviews, or let me ask it this way. The time period between the alleged torture and the research, what is the interval there?
Yeah.
Was it during the same period or after, or what is the position?
So it was different for different ones. So if we started interviewing mid-1983
Yes.
to the end of 1984.
Yes.
So some of the 1983 and 84 interviews were very fresh. But the ones from 74, and most were post-76, but the ones 74, 75 would have had a time period, what would that, 7 years for those ones? But that would be the maximum, 7 years.
I see. And if one considers your table it seems that the torture was evenly spread across the then 4 provinces.
It was, but
Or were there other provinces that
Oh.
expressed more, that were more equal than others in respect
Yeah.
of torture?
Our view from our research, you know, the more, it doesn't seem right to compare, but the border Eastern Cape was really, really sadistic at another level. So with all the numbers, and if you follow the reports of the torture, you're going to see Eastern Cape and border, and then KwaZulu-Natal, Gauteng, Western Cape, you know, come. But I think especially, that does emerge. Although the methods are the same around the country, but the amount in the Eastern Cape and border were higher.
Any questions? Are there not of the questions for the council?
No further questions.
Thank you. Council?
No.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. Council?
My lord, the family would like to call Mr. Robert Wilcox.
Thank you.
We state the full name for the report. Please state your full names for the report.
Robert Wilcox.
You said that the evidence of what you give will be truthful, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Please raise the right hand and so submit your report. Thank you.
Thank you. Council?
Mr. Wilcox has to post an affidavit, and I beg leave to hand affidavit up and one for Mr. Wilcox. And that will be annexure F12. Mr. Wilcox, I know this is, that period of your life is very traumatic, and you're going to relive that experience here to assist in this inquest. But thank you very much for being here today. Mr. Wilcox, you have a copy of the affidavit, and you're familiar with its content?
Yes,
Thank you. And Mr. Wilcox, you are currently retired.
that's correct.
What did you do prior to retiring?
I was a systems analyst in IT.
Now, Mr. Wilcox, when were you born and where were you born?
I was born in Wynberg, Cape Town in 1938.
And you said that you were aware of the injustices of apartheid and capitalism from a young age.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Sorry, Mr. Wilcox. And what made you aware? What made you aware of these injustices as a young child?
As a young child, my family was very instrumental in explaining to me what was wrong in society and encouraged me to do little things that would assist as a fellow.
And then, Mr. Wilcox, what did you qualify as?
I firstly worked as a bookkeeper accountant. That was the only job I could get where it was reasonably paid. It wasn't well paid, it was reasonably paid. But after I went to prison, I did a degree in mathematics and computer science, and that allowed me to enter the world of IT.
Thank you.
Council, I'm advised that you are speaking too soft for the machine. Right. Just try to speak up. I think even to play the back, maybe you
Mr. Wilcox, when did your political activism begin?
I would say while I was at high school, because there I used to sell magazines, political magazines, and used to pamphlet here in the streets for meetings.
And what organization did you belong to?
I belonged to the African People's Democratic Union of Southern Africa, ADUSA, and before that the Cape Peninsula Students Union.
And could you explain what these organizations did and the purpose of ADUSA?
The purpose of ADUSA was to liberate the country from oppression and exploitation.
And when did you first encounter Speaker van Wyk?
He used to track us when we were working, doing field work, visiting houses and so on. They would track us and keep an eye on us. Once in Athlone, when we were pamphleteering, a whole group of us was picked up, taken to the police station, all our personal details taken by Speaker and his brother, and then we were released. On other occasions, they would raid our house and other people's houses and seize documents and books, and which would never return. So I became familiar with who he was and what his brother was doing, and knew him before. At the time I knew who he was.
So it was him and his brother that would do these raids and be patrolling in the areas.
That's correct.
And what was your relation? What was your interpretation of the relationship between the brothers?
I would say that Speaker, or Johannes van Wyk, was the more intelligent one, and whereas Andries was the one who was physical. He was abusive and physical. Not to say that Speaker was not, but Speaker would sit behind his desk and take notes, whereas Andries would be on the floor mishandling me and so on. So I would place Speaker van Wyk as the more senior person, although he was younger in age.
And when were you arrested?
I was arrested in February 1971.
And where were you arrested from?
I was arrested from my home in Windhoek, a flat in Windhoek.
And who was with you at the time?
At the time was my wife, my son, he was 3 years old, and my daughter was 3 months old,
And why were you arrested?
on charges of terrorism. But that wasn't made up plain straight away. I was just being detained under the Detention Act. I don't know what it was called. The Terrorism Act allowed them to detain persons for up to 90 days or even beyond.
And subsequently you established that more people had been detained.
Yes,
Can you
I
tell
found out that in Cape Town alone, 14 members of ADUSA had been detained. As for the rest of the country, there were up to 200 arrested in different parts of the country.
And you were part of a group of 11 at that point who were going to be, who had submitted affidavits with regard to Nabi Pillai's husband, who had also been detained. Can you
Yes.
remember
Yes,
what
but
happened then?
those affidavits were only submitted while we were on trial,
Okay.
that we were no longer in the hands of the special branch.
And that was a trial, and the purpose of those affidavits. Can you remember the purpose of those affidavits?
I don't remember very clearly, but I understood that it was that Nabi Pillai was making an application that the husband, care must be taken that the husband is not tortured, and the affidavits were submitted in support of the argument.
And the affidavit you submitted, you also based what you're going to talk, what you're going to tell the court today,
Yes.
was based on the affidavit submitted at that time,
Yes, in part.
in part. So when you were first arrested, where were you detained?
I was first, when I was arrested, I was taken to Caledon Square, Cape Town, and was booked in, as it were, and then immediately taken to Pollsmoor prison, where I stayed for a week before I was brought back to Caledon Square for interrogation.
Right. And then from there, you
I
were,
was interrogated best part of half a day,
right,
after which I was taken to Maitland Police Station.
to Maitland Police Station. And who was in charge of your interrogation?
Well, I was taken into an office where there were about 6 or 8 security police. Spyker was sitting behind his desk, the others were on the floor, and Spyker demanded that I must speak and tell them everything, because otherwise I'm going to be in big trouble. Jy's 'n kak, were his words. Excuse me.
And what did he say about your wife?
He didn't say anything about my wife at that stage, but he threatened that unless I tell them everything, I will not see my daughter again until she is a married woman. He can keep me there in detention for 15 years or more.
So, Mr. Wilcox, I know this is going to be very hard for you, but can you tell the court the type of physical torture that you had to endure under Spyker van Wyk?
Yeah. As I said, that I was in a small office surrounded by about 6 or 8 security policemen. I was firstly made to sit on an imaginary chair, sort of with your arms akimbo like that, and sitting as if you were sitting on a chair, but there's no chair to on your haunches. And that, after a very short period, becomes very painful. You feel the pain in your thighs and your calves. And as a result, I would fall to the floor. I was immediately dragged up again, pushed against the wall, and made to sit in that position again until I couldn't take it anymore. And they picked me up, as I remember, Andries in particular, picking me up and bashing me physically against the wall. After that, I was made to stand on 2 bricks on my toes, just on my tiptoes. You slipped off, you again get dragged up and put in that tiptoe position. At one stage, one of the police stood on my feet so that I couldn't fall off, but that didn't help. I still tumbled backwards. And then the arrangement was changed to staying with bricks. Instead of standing on flat bricks, stood on slanted bricks, which made you want to tip over backwards, which I couldn't maintain. And it was also very, very painful. Subsequently, I was made to hold 2 bricks in the air and walk around the floor. Now, it was impossible to do that without bumping into one of the policemen. And I was made to apologize, say, Jana, why are you doing that? Why do you bump into me? And I couldn't help anything but to bump into them. After that, I was made to step over a chair repeatedly, holding the bricks, walking around and around and around, and back again into a sitting position. So that was the way things happened. But all the time I was being verbally abused. Jy sal praat and threatened, that you are going to be here a long time if you don't.
And Mr. Wilcox, at one point in your affidavit, you state that you were choked.
Yes. At one stage when I had fallen to the ground, one policeman came in, he pulled me up and twisted my shirt collar around my neck tightly and choked me until I could hardly breathe.
And then you were taken back to Maitland.
I was then taken to Maitland for the first time.
And that's when the Spyker van Wyk said that they detained your wife. Was it at
That was much later.
Okay.
I will just explain that when I got to Maitland, it was a big cell, but painted completely black up to about 6 feet right around. And a toilet with a wire chain and a small dim lit globe covered with wire, very high up on the ceiling. So it was a very grim cell. It was just a couple of felt mats and a couple of blankets. I stayed there for a couple of months, and then one day, as you have mentioned now, Spyker and somebody else came in and told me, "Jy het net 'n klomp kak gepraat. Now we've arrested your wife. We've detained your wife, and we're going to make her talk." So when he left, he didn't stay there very long. He just abused me and left. I then asked to see the commanding officer of the police station, which was then later granted. I told the commanding officer, look, my wife has been detained. I need somebody now to accept power of attorney from me who can handle my financial affairs. That was something they could not refuse as far as I understood. The commanding officer looked at me, without saying anything, he went away. An hour later he returned, so he told me, nee, daar is nie so 'n ding nie, there isn't such anything, your wife has been detained. And I was overjoyed, of course.
And while you were in detention, you were seen by a magistrate.
Yes, you are required to see a magistrate every 2 weeks, every fortnight. The magistrate will just come and peep in at the door, sometimes to say, is he all right? And then walk away. You hardly had a chance to speak to him. At Maitland, I complained that I wasn't getting sufficient food. I would get meal porridge in the morning and 2 slices of bread with minced fish for lunch, and again 2 slices of bread with minced fish for supper, and that was totally inadequate. And I complained about that. There was a slight improvement in that. I was then moved back after 3 months back to Caledon Square.
Can I just stop you there, Mr.
Yeah.
Wilcox? So for the 3 months that you were in Maitland, you were in solitary confinement.
Solitary confinement.
And what impact did that have on Mr. Wilcox?
Well, it was really depressing, and you're wondering what is happening in the rest of the world and what is going to happen to you. You just don't know. You are completely isolated. They would only take me out of the cell for about half an hour a day for some exercise in the courtyard there, and they would scrub the cell with Jay's food and water and put me in the cell that was reserved for whites. Then back to the cell, which was wet, and I would have to stay there for the rest of the afternoon and the evening.
And it was only half an hour exercise.
Half an hour exercise a day.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. And then, sorry, I interrupted you. And then you were taken back to Caledon Square.
Yes.
And then what happened there?
At first, nothing much happened. I was just put in a small cell, about 8 by 5 or 8 by 6, very small. And there, again, there was a natural bucket and a jam tin of water. That's what you had to yourself there. In the mornings, you were taken out to the bathroom where you could empty the natural bucket and clean up a bit, and then taken into the back courtyard, wire covered roof, where you had a half an hour exercise. That was my treatment here, but then I was taken back for interrogation, and they insisted that I hadn't spoken the truth, and I said, and they told me, we know everything, so why don't you just tell us? So my answer was, if you know everything, why do I have to tell you? That made them very, very angry, and swore at me again and so on. They didn't physically torture me on the second occasion, but it was verbal abuse, right? And whatever statement they had, they took notes of, but they didn't express satisfaction with that statement. I was taken back to the cell where I stayed for another couple of months.
And so how long were you detained for overall?
From February 1971 to around about June 1971, yeah.
And throughout that period, you only had the clothes that you wore?
Yes, we only had the clothes here. We were allowed to receive the soap and toothpaste from home, but nothing else. At one stage, the police used to inspect daily, the ordinary police, and they would come to me and say, why are you still here? You should have been in court already. What are you detained for? They say you're a terrorist. Did you carry a gun? I said, no, I never carried a gun. But why aren't you in court yet? How can they keep you here all the time? And he became quite sympathetic. He was a warrant officer or something. And when he left, he threw a packet of cigarettes through the window. And boxer matches. That kept me going for a while.
And then how long were you on trial for?
We left Cape Town, we were taken up to Cape Town, 4 of us from Cape Town, we were taken up to Pietermaritzburg by Andries and Pieter Spijker.
By Angus and Spijker?
Yeah, we went in a van and they sat in front. Basically, we stopped over at Port Elizabeth and then continued to Maritzburg the next day. From the time we arrived in Maritzburg, we fell out of their hands and under the hand of the law, as it were, under the prison system. There, we met up with the 4 of us from Cape Town, met up with detainees from other areas, Joburg, Soweto, Durban, Maritzburg itself, from the old Transkei and Wonderland. Yeah, so there were 14 of us in all who were charged with terrorism.
And charged and convicted.
Yes. The trial lasted for 8 months.
And you were in prison for how long?
From February 1971 to April 1978, so that is over, that's 7.25 years.
On Robben Island?
No, I was in Robben Island for 6 years as a sentenced prisoner. The rest of the time was detention and awaiting trial.
Mr. Wilcox, can I take you back to Maitland Police Station? Were you able, you had the same clothes, were you able to take showers, to wash, you said you were provided with soap and toothpaste?
To a limited extent, you could watch, but you couldn't have a proper bath or anything.
And so where would you wash?
They would take you out of the cell, and there was a tap, I think, in the yard where you could rinse your face and so on. But otherwise, inside the cell, you could only use the water that was available to you besides the toilet water, which I didn't use at all.
And would someone be watching you
No.
while you washed?
No.
So in your cell, no one would be watching, but when you were outside washing your
They could
face,
see what I was doing, yes.
yeah. And would you undress
Partly.
partly and then you just have a quick clean? Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. And then after your release from prison, from Robben Island, what did you then do, Mr. Wilcox?
I was banned, put in a rendered banning orders for 5 years, which lasted for 3 years, after which they gave up the problem of banning people and keeping track of them. So I was banned for 3 years, in actual fact. I then found work after a period of about 6 months, where I managed to get into the computer industry.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. Mr. Wilcox, is there anything else that you'd like to say to this court today?
I would just like to relate an incident that can make sense or doesn't make sense on Robben Island. We were a group of about 8 to 10 prisoners sitting in a circle where we were made to break up the slate stones which we use it for concrete aggregate. And we decided we were going to tell one another what our experiences was in detention. And every time one spoke, he would laugh and he said, they did this to me and that and this. And the rest of us said, praat, you don't praat. And we all took turns laughing at one another. It was a kind of catharsis. But at the end, the question arose. If you were given a choice of 6 months isolation and detention under the control of the security police, or 5 years imprisonment on Robben Island, what would you choose? And the answer was unanimous, Robben Island, 5 years please.
Thank you. No further questions, my lord.
Thank you. Counsel? No further question from the state court.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Counsel?
No further witnesses, my lord, for today.
No further witnesses for today. I see. So we will resume again tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Do you have any comment related?
None. It's a lot of the state.
Thank you. Was that everything for the day?